Well, there's a problem with that too. Even if we were to, just for the sake of argument, say that maybe someone just let them in to do their thing, or they somehow gained access without being discovered, the next question is, why would they have done that? Because we know that the buildings came down symmetrically into their footprints, thereby doing the least possible amount of damage to the adjacent structures. If it were possible, and I don't believe it is, but if it were possible for an aircraft collision plus fire to bring down a skyscraper, the damage, as we've discussed earlier, was not symmetrical. The buildings, by all rights, should have toppled over and damaged many more buildings.
More like a tree.
And killed many more people than they did. So I think it's safe to conclude that had the, assuming there are explosives, and I believe that there are, I think you can't argue otherwise, you can't believe, it's not believable that Al-Qaeda would have wanted those explosives to be there. It makes no sense.
Right.
So we're talking about a lot of technical details, but those people at home viewing this, just think about the buildings you saw on TV, those buildings coming down. Well, if you look really closely at those pictures you saw on TV, you can see squibs of smoke coming out of the sides of the buildings. And ask yourselves, how does this happen from the airplanes hit and the buildings come down, squibs of smoke come out of the sides? This wasn't caused by the airplanes. These explosives were planted all through the building. That's how controlled demolition works. And the squibs of smoke coming out are as the explosives go off all up and down the building to make it come down symmetrically. Isn't that right?
Yeah, and there's also kind of a cascading effect of liquid iron. And you can tell that by spectrographic analysis. So something is melting the iron, and it could only be a very high-tech incendiary device, explosive device. It couldn't be jet fuel, the temperatures are much too low. It couldn't be paper trash burning, the temperatures are much too low. And you see this cascading molten iron. And of course, after the collapse, for weeks and weeks afterwards, temperatures were found and reported to be above 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit in the 7-story basements of the Twin Towers and of Building 7. So somehow temperatures reached an enormous degree of intensity, and this could not have happened from paper waste fires or from jet fuel, which, as Frank pointed out, was dissipated in the first 10 to 15 minutes. So something extremely thermic was added to this complex, and we just need to find out what that was.
And this is something that NIST. I mean, there's a few things that make their theory impossible, and that is you can't have a 1,500 degree fire make 2,500 degree molten metal. It just doesn't work. An elementary school kid can figure that out. The hottest it can get is 1,500 degrees, and this molten metal was over 1,000 degrees hotter. And when NIST was confronted with this, why didn't you look into this molten metal? They said it didn't exist. We've never heard of that. And there's videos of it. There's testimony from firefighters and people are cleaning up that weeks afterwards there was rivers of molten metal. They said it looked like a foundry running down into the basement floors of this building. And the lead investigator, after they released their report, said, oh, we never heard of that. Well, they didn't look for it. They ignored it. And this is probably the biggest thing that makes their theory absolutely impossible. Like I say, you can't have 1,500 degrees turn into 25 degrees without this added chemical element.
We know from carbon-based fuels like jet fuel and paper, it's all carbon-based, and there's an absolute limit to how the highest temperature you can get to, even if it burns with perfect oxygen, which we know it didn't because the smoke was black. But if you got maximum amount of oxygen into the fire, I think the maximum limit in temperature would be 1,800. And that is still less than the temperature, the melting point of steel. So you don't get the columns to melt. Anyway, there's just so many problems with this.
Terry, if I could, you know, I know that there are a lot of people who have tried to support the official story by saying that these towers, and for that matter, Building 7, were not typical construction, in fact, that they were defective. Well, I think Charles had already addressed the fact that these buildings were, in fact, over-engineered. And in fact, if you go to our website, you can go to the compilation of evidence, and we actually show you, among other things, a floor plan, and you will see that the majority of the interior of these towers were, in fact, this framework of box columns, and that the actual spans of floors were very narrow in relationship to this center column, which there's no reason for this whole column, this whole set of 47 box columns, to have collapsed at all. Even if the floors around them had somehow collapsed, they shouldn't have. But what I really wanted to get back to was these buildings were over-engineered. The design may have been innovative, but it was extremely successful, and it's been followed since with buildings that have been on fire that have never collapsed. But I wanted to read a really telling quote from one of the designers who made this statement in an interview in January of 2001. Unfortunately, he lost his life in the Trade Center on September 11th. And this was one of the designers. His name was Frank DiMartini. And he's on video, so you can see this in several of the documentaries. Here's what he said about the Twin Towers, each of them. He said, "The building was designed to have a fully loaded 707 crash into it. That was the largest plane at the time. I believe that the building probably could sustain multiple impacts of jetliners, because this structure is like a mosquito netting on your screen door, this intense grid, and the jet plane is just a pencil puncturing that screen netting. It really does nothing to the screen netting." That's an amazing statement. And again, I think we talked about earlier the fact that the 757s that did strike the towers, in terms of their weight and speed and therefore their kinetic energy, were not significantly larger than the 707s that were planned for. There are many similar statements by the designers of these buildings indicating that they had designed them to withstand the impacts of planes, multiple planes, and the notion that the buildings were defective, inferior, couldn't withstand the impacts and the subsequent office fires, it's just simply not believable.
I remember watching on TV the cleanup process, and perhaps at home you remember watching too. The trucks coming in and the big steel girders going on the trucks to be carted off and sold to China. But it's a convenient coincidence that all of the steel was cut in the attack and in the supposed fires, was cut to the right lengths to fit on the trucks. So it didn't have to be recut. They just take the steel as it came down from the explosion and put it on the truck and carry it off. And they did that really fast to get the steel out of there before anybody could examine it. Does anybody remember that?
I think we all remember it, but I would say that there was some examination of some steel remnants that was done by FEMA in looking into the collapses. And again, this is amazing because, I think the general public doesn't understand that even the reports that our government agencies performed are not consistent and do not explain the facts. The FEMA report, in fact, they did get a sample of the steel, and they talked about a strange thing they found in some of the steel that they observed, they analyzed. There was sulfidation, which meant that there was a presence of sulfur that burned the steel. There was oxidation, and basically these steel samples that they looked at had the appearance of Swiss cheese. They were very thin, paper-like, had holes in them, and they themselves said, this is one of the greatest mysteries of this tragedy. End of story, never went further than that, it just sits there. So yes, the steel was shipped off in a fashion that bothered typical fire investigator agencies. It was a problem. But the fact is, some of the steel was analyzed, and it raised even more questions that were never pursued.